in the remote highlands of Kenya's Masai Mara, where acacia trees stretched their thorny branches toward an endless sky. A moment unfolded that would challenge everything scientists thought they knew about wild animal behavior. A leopard mother, driven by desperation and an instinct deeper than survival itself, was about to make a decision that would save 2 lives and shock wildlife experts around the world. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rugged terrain as Dr. James Mitchell, a 38-year-old former Navy medic turned wildlife veterinarian, guided his weathered Land Cruiser along the dusty research trail. The vehicle's engine hummed steadily as he navigated between scattered termite mounds and clusters of whistling thorn trees. His destination was a remote monitoring station where reports of unusual leopard activity had been trickling in for the past week. Mitchell had been working in Kenya for 18 months, trying to rebuild his life after leaving military service. The transition from treating wounded soldiers in Afghanistan to caring for injured wildlife had been his attempt at finding peace, though the nightmares from his 3 tours of duty still haunted his sleep. His weathered hands gripped the steering wheel as he scanned the landscape, noting the unusual silence that seemed to blanket the normally vibrant ecosystem. As he rounded a bend near a cluster of granite boulders, movement caught his peripheral vision. There, partially hidden in the tall grass beside a massive rock formation, was a female leopard in obvious distress. Her powerful body was tense, her breathing labored, and even from 50 meters away, Mitchell could see something was terribly wrong. The big cat's golden coat was matted with sweat, and her normally alert posture had given way to exhaustion. Mitchell cut the engine and reached for his binoculars, his military training automatically kicking in as he assessed the situation. Through the lenses, he could see the leopard was in the final stages of labor, but something had gone catastrophically wrong. The birthing process that should have taken hours had clearly stretched into a dangerous ordeal, and the isolated location meant she had no protection from the hyenas and wild dogs whose calls echoed in the distance. Over the next 6 grueling hours, Mitchell watched through his binoculars as nature played out one of its most brutal dramas. The female leopard managed to deliver 4 cubs, each one emerging wet and mewling into the harsh African sun. 3 of the newborns appeared strong and healthy, immediately crawling toward their mother's warmth and beginning to nurse with vigorous determination. Their tiny cries filled the air as they competed for the best feeding positions. But the 4th cub told a different story entirely. Significantly smaller than his siblings, and alarmingly weak, he struggled even to lift his head. His cries were barely audible whispers compared to the robust calls of his brothers and sisters. The mother leopard licked him frantically, trying to stimulate his breathing and circulation, but his responses remained frighteningly minimal. His tiny rib cage rose and fell in irregular patterns that Mitchell recognized all too well from his battlefield medical experience. As the day wore on, the temperature began to drop and storm clouds gathered on the horizon. The mother leopard's anxiety became palpable as she repeatedly tried to move her cubs to higher ground, carrying each one carefully in her powerful jaws. But with each relocation, the smallest cub fell further behind. He couldn't compete with his siblings for milk, was pushed aside during nursing, and grew visibly weaker with each passing hour. By the 3rd day, Mitchell realized he was witnessing something unprecedented. The mother leopard kept returning to stare directly at his vehicle, her piercing yellow eyes filled with an intelligence that seemed almost human. She would position herself between her healthy cubs and the weakest one, as if making some kind of impossible calculation. Her behavior defied every textbook Mitchell had studied about leopard maternal instincts. Then came the moment that would haunt wildlife biology journals for years to come. The mother leopard picked up her dying cub and began walking directly toward Mitchell's Land Cruiser. Not the cautious, circuitous approach of a wild animal, but a deliberate, purposeful stride. She stopped just 10 feet from his vehicle, placed the cub gently on the ground, and looked directly into Mitchell's eyes. In that gaze was something that transcended species barriers, a desperate mother's plea for help that needed no translation. Mitchell sat frozen in his driver's seat, his heart pounding as the implications of what he was witnessing crashed over him. In 15 years of military service and wildlife work combined, he had never encountered anything remotely similar. The mother leopard remained motionless, her gaze unwavering, as if waiting for some kind of response or acknowledgement. The tiny cub lay between them, his breathing so shallow it was barely perceptible. What the leopard couldn't possibly know was that James Mitchell carried more than just veterinary trainings. Before his deployment to Afghanistan, he had completed advanced battlefield medicine certification, specializing in trauma care for the most critically injured soldiers. His hands had worked to save lives in conditions far worse than this remote African plain. More importantly, those same hands had once failed to save the life that mattered most to him. 3 years earlier, during his final tour in Kandahar, Mitchell's unit had come under heavy fire during a routine patrol. His best friend and fellow medic, Sergeant David Chen, had been caught in an IED explosion that left him with massive internal injuries. For 47 minutes, Mitchell had worked desperately to keep Chen alive, using every technique he knew, pushing his medical skills to their absolute limit. But Chen had died in his arms, just 3 miles from the base hospital. His last words a request for Mitchell to tell his newborn daughter that her father loved her. The guilt from that day had driven Mitchell out of the military and eventually to this remote research station in Kenya. He had convinced himself that he was better suited to helping animals than humans, that somehow the stakes would be lower and the failures less devastating. But now, staring at this dying leopard cub, he felt the same crushing weight of responsibility that had haunted him since Afghanistan. Mitchell slowly opened his vehicle door, moving with the deliberate caution of someone who understood he was about to cross a line that could never be uncrossed. The mother leopard watched his every movement but showed no signs of aggression. Instead, she took several steps backward, giving him space while keeping her eyes locked on his face. It was as if she understood that her extraordinary gamble was about to be tested, and that everything depended on this stranger's next decision. Mitchell knelt beside the fragile cub, his trained eyes immediately assessing the severity of the situation. The tiny creature weighed no more than 300 grams, his golden fur still damp and matted. Through his stethoscope, Mitchell detected an irregular heartbeat that he recognized instantly. A heart murmur consistent with a septal defect, the same condition that had claimed too many young lives during his medical career. The cub's body temperature was dangerously low, his breathing rapid and shallow, and his gums showed the pale coloration of severe anemia. Without hesitation, Mitchell activated the emergency medical kit he always carried in his vehicle. Working with the precision of someone who had performed countless life-saving procedures under fire, he established a tiny intravenous line using pediatric equipment, beginning fluid resuscitation to address the dehydration that threatened the cub's already compromised cardiovascular system. His hands moved with muscle memory as he calculated dosages based on the animal's weight and condition. The parallels to his military service were impossible to ignore, but this time felt different. There was no incoming artillery, no screaming commanders, no time pressure from an evacuation helicopter. Just him, his skills, and a mother's desperate trust. As he worked, the female leopard maintained her vigil from a respectful distance, occasionally calling softly to her healthy cubs who waited near the rocks. Her behavior continued to defy explanation. She should have fled with her viable offspring, yet she remained, as if understanding that her weakest child's survival depended entirely on this human stranger. Mitchell wrapped the cub in a thermal blanket and carefully placed him in a makeshift incubator constructed from his camping gear. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was using the same emergency medicine techniques that had failed to save Chen, but applying them to a leopard cub in the middle of nowhere. As he initiated glucose supplementation through a feeding tube, he found himself speaking quietly to the tiny patient, the same reassuring words he had whispered to wounded soldiers who needed to believe they would survive. He, well. For the first time since leaving Afghanistan, Mitchell felt the familiar surge of purpose that came from fighting death itself. The cub's heart rate began to stabilize under his care, and he made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He would take this leopard cub back to the research station, and this time he would not fail to save a life that had been placed in his hands. The research station's makeshift veterinary clinic became Mitchell's world for the next 4 months. He named the cub Kesi, a Swahili word meaning born during troubled times, and threw himself into the animal's care with an intensity that surprised his colleagues. Working 18-hour days, Mitchell monitored every heartbeat, tracked every gram of weight gain, and celebrated each small milestone as if it were a major victory. Dr. Sarah Ocheng, the station's lead wildlife biologist, initially questioned Mitchell's decision to invest so much time and resources in a single animal, but as she watched him work, adjusting medication dosages with the precision of a trauma surgeon and developing innovative feeding techniques that accounted for Kesi's cardiac limitations, She began to understand that this was about more than veterinary care. Mitchell was fighting demons she couldn't see, using this leopard cub as his battlefield. The healing process proved mutual and profound. As Kesi grew stronger, learning to walk steadily and eventually climb the makeshift jungle gym Mitchell constructed in the rehabilitation enclosure, Mitchell found his own nightmares beginning to fade. The hypervigilance that had made him jump at every unexpected sound started to diminish. For the first time since Afghanistan, he slept through entire nights without waking in cold sweats, remembering the weight of David Chen's lifeless body. Kesi's personality emerged as his health improved, playful but cautious, intelligent beyond typical leopard behavior, and inexplicably bonded to Mitchell in ways that defied normal human-animal relationships. The cub would wait by the enclosure gate each morning for Mitchell's arrival, purring in a way that reminded everyone who heard it that despite his size, he was still fundamentally a cat. Mitchell began teaching him hunting skills, using toys and eventually live prey, always mindful that the ultimate goal was preparing Kesi for eventual return to the wild. The research station staff watched this unlikely partnership with fascination and growing concern. Mitchell's dedication was admirable, but they worried about his ability to let go when the time came. Weekly progress reports documented not just Kesi's physical development, but the gradual transformation of a haunted veteran into someone who laughed again, who engaged with his colleagues, and who seemed to have rediscovered his purpose. The leopard cub was healing more than just his own heart defect. At 18 months old, Kesi had grown into a magnificent young leopard weighing nearly 30 kilograms. His golden coat gleamed with health, and his distinctive rosette patterns had developed into the perfect camouflage of his species. Yet the small scar on his chest remained visible, a permanent reminder of those early desperate days when survival had hung by the thinnest thread. Despite his cardiac condition limiting his speed and endurance compared to wild leopards, Kesi had become an efficient hunter within the controlled environment of the research station's extended territory. The team of wildlife experts had been monitoring Kesi's development for months, documenting his hunting success rate, territorial behaviors, and social responses. Their conclusion was unanimous but difficult. Kesi was ready for the next phase of reintegration. The 200-hectare semi-wild reserve, surrounded by electrified fencing but containing natural prey and minimal human interference, would serve as his transition zone before potential full release. Mitchell stood at the observation tower overlooking the reserve, watching Kesi stalk a young impala through the acacia groves below. The leopard's technique was flawless. Patient, calculated, using terrain and wind direction with the instinctive knowledge of his species. When Kesi made his final approach, Mitchell's chest tightened with pride and an ache he couldn't name. This was what they had worked toward for over a year, yet watching it unfold felt like preparing for an amputation. Dr. Ochang approached quietly, understanding the internal battle Mitchell was fighting. She had seen him train Kesi for this moment, teaching independence while struggling with his own attachment. The leopard completed his hunt with textbook precision, and for several minutes afterward seemed to sense Mitchell's presence in the tower. Kesi looked up directly at him, those amber eyes holding the same intelligence that had first shocked the research team. That evening, Mitchell made the call to the Kenya Wildlife Service, formally requesting approval for Kesi's transfer to the transition reserve. His voice remained steady as he provided the required assessments and recommendations, but his hands shook slightly as he signed the paperwork. The date was set for the following week. After 547 days of constant companionship, Mitchell would have to trust that everything he had taught Kesi about survival would be enough. The leopard who had saved his soul was about to test whether Mitchell had truly saved his life. The transport to the semi-wild reserve took place at dawn, when the air was cool and Kesi would be most comfortable. Mitchell rode in the vehicle alongside the specially designed transport crate, speaking in low tones to keep the leopard calm during the 40-minute journey. When they reached the release point deep within the reserve, Mitchell's hands trembled slightly as he operated the crate's remote opening mechanism. Kesi emerged cautiously, testing the air with his acute senses, then padded silently into the dense vegetation without looking back. For the first 3 weeks, GPS tracking data showed Kesi moving cautiously through his new territory, establishing a hunting range and avoiding the reserve's other leopard residents. He successfully caught small prey, dik-diks, young warthogs, and various bird species. demonstrating that his hunting skills had translated perfectly to the larger environment. Mitchell checked the tracking data obsessively, finding comfort in each successful hunt recorded by the monitoring equipment. On day 24, something remarkable appeared in the camera trap footage. Kesi had encountered Django, a mature female leopard who had been living in the reserve for 2 years after her own rehabilitation. Instead of the territorial confrontation the researchers expected, the footage showed careful, almost ritualistic interactions. Django seemed to be assessing this newcomer, and over several days their encounters became increasingly tolerant. Within 6 weeks, the impossible had happened. Camera traps captured images of Kesi and Django sharing kills, grooming each other, and displaying mating behaviors that suggested a pair bond was forming. Wildlife biologists called it unprecedented. 2 rehabilitated leopards, both with physical limitations that would have meant death in the wild, had found each other and adapted together. Mitchell received the news during his morning rounds at the research station. Dr. Ochieng showed him the photographs with barely contained excitement, pointing out the subtle body language that indicated not just tolerance, but genuine affection between the 2 leopards. In one image, Kesi rested his head against Django's flank while she cleaned his scarred chest, an intimate gesture that spoke of deep trust and companionship. That night, Mitchell stood on his cottage porch looking toward the distant reserve boundaries. Somewhere in that darkness, Kesi was building a life Mitchell had never dared imagine possible. The leopard had found not just survival, but love and purpose. For the first time since Afghanistan, Mitchell felt the tight knot of responsibility in his chest finally begin to loosen. 8 months after Kesi's release, motion-activated cameras captured footage that would fundamentally change how wildlife biologists understood leopard social behavior and rehabilitation success. The images showed Kesi and Django with 3 healthy cubs, their spotted coats gleaming as they played near a waterhole deep within the reserve. Despite his congenital heart condition, Kesi had become a devoted father, sharing hunting duties with Django and demonstrating the same patient-teaching behaviors that Mitchell had once shown him. Mitchell first saw the photographs during a routine monitoring meeting, and the impact hit him like a physical blow. There was Kesi, now a fully mature leopard weighing 38 kilograms, gently carrying one of his cubs by the scruff, while the other 2 tumbled around their mother's feet. The scarred chest that had once risen and fell with such fragile irregularity now powered a body that had created new life in the African wilderness. The success story attracted international attention, with wildlife conservation organizations citing Kesi's case as proof that intensive rehabilitation could work even for animals with significant medical challenges. Donations poured in to expand the reserve and establish similar programs across East Africa. Mitchell found himself reluctantly thrust into the spotlight, giving interviews to National Geographic and speaking at veterinary conferences about the intersection of battlefield medicine and wildlife conservation. But the real transformation had happened within Mitchell himself. The guilt that had driven him from military service had evolved into something more constructive, a deep understanding that failure and loss were part of the healing process, not evidence of personal inadequacy. He began corresponding with David Chen's widow, sharing stories about Kesi, and eventually visiting Chen's daughter, who was now old enough to understand who Uncle James really was and why her father had spoken of him so often. Mitchell continued working at the research station, but with a different perspective on his role. He was no longer hiding from his past or trying to prove his worth through perfect outcomes. Instead, he had learned the most valuable lesson that both military medicine and wildlife conservation could teach. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't preventing death, but recognizing when you've given life its best possible chance. In the distant reserve, 3 leopard cubs played under their father's watchful eye, living proof that love and determination could overcome even the most impossible odds. 2 years later, Mitchell received an unexpected visitor at the research station. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a trauma psychologist from the Veterans Affairs Hospital in Nairobi, had been following his story through medical journals and conservation publications. She arrived with a proposal that would challenge everything Mitchell thought he understood about his own journey and purpose. Dr. Rodriguez had been developing an innovative therapy program for combat veterans struggling with PTSD, using animal rehabilitation as a form of therapeutic intervention. She had read about Mitchell's transformation and Kesi's remarkable recovery, recognizing patterns that could help other veterans find their way back from the psychological wounds of war. Her research suggested that caring for vulnerable animals created neural pathways that could bypass traditional trauma responses, allowing veterans to process grief and guilt in healthier ways. "What you accomplished with Kesi wasn't just veterinary medicine," Dr. Rodriguez explained as they walked through the research station's facilities. "You created a healing partnership that worked both ways. The question is whether you'd be willing to help other veterans discover what you found here." Her proposal was ambitious. Establish a formal program where combat veterans could work alongside wildlife veterinarians, contributing their medical skills to conservation efforts while processing their own trauma through meaningful work. Mitchell's initial reaction was resistance. He had found his peace in the isolation of the research station, and the idea of reopening old wounds by working with other traumatized soldiers felt overwhelming. But Dr. Rodriguez had brought letters from veterans across East Africa who had heard his story, Marines who couldn't sleep, Army medics who had left medicine entirely, Air Force personnel who had lost their sense of purpose after leaving service. One letter, from a former Navy corpsman named Sarah Martinez, struck him particularly hard. She described nightmares similar to his own, the crushing weight of lives she couldn't save, and her current work as a hotel manager in Mombasa because she could no longer bear the responsibility of medical decision-making. "I heard about what you did with that leopard," she wrote. "I keep thinking that maybe I could help something heal too, if someone would give me the chance." That evening, Mitchell sat in his usual spot on the cottage porch, but instead of looking toward Kesi's distant territory, he found himself imagining a different kind of rehabilitation center. One where broken soldiers could rebuild their lives by saving other broken creatures, where the skills learned in war could be transformed into tools for conservation and healing. 18 months after Dr. Rodriguez's visit, the Kesi Foundation officially opened its doors in a renovated facility 30 kilometers from the original research station. Named after the leopard who had started it all, the program now housed 12 military veterans from 4 different countries, each working alongside professional wildlife veterinarians to rehabilitate injured and orphaned animals across Kenya's national park system. Mitchell watched from the main building as former Marine Sergeant Lisa Thompson carefully bottle-fed an orphaned elephant calf, her movements gentle despite hands that had once assembled weapons in Iraq. Nearby, ex-Army medic Carlos Vega monitored the vital signs of a black rhino recovering from poaching injuries, his trauma training proving invaluable in critical care situations. The transformation he witnessed daily reminded him that healing was never a solitary journey. The program's success rates spoke for themselves. 93% of participating veterans reported significant improvements in sleep quality and PTSD symptoms within 6 months. More importantly, 87% had chosen to remain in conservation work after completing the program, creating a new generation of trauma-informed wildlife professionals. The animals benefited equally. Rehabilitation success rates had improved dramatically with the veterans' medical expertise and around-the-clock dedication. On quiet evenings, Mitchell still drove to the observation point overlooking Kesi's territory. Now 5 years old, the leopard had become a grandfather, with Django having successfully raised 2 litters in the reserve. Recent camera footage showed him teaching his latest cubs the same patient hunting techniques that Mitchell had once demonstrated with toys and targets. The cycle of learning, healing, and growth continued in ways neither species had anticipated. The foundation had attracted international recognition, with similar programs being established in South Africa, Botswana, and Tanzania. Military medical personnel from around the world applied for positions, drawn by the promise of transforming combat skills into conservation victories. Mitchell found himself traveling frequently, consulting on new programs and training other veteran coordinators, but he always returned to Kenya and the place where his own healing had begun. The mother leopard who had placed her dying cub in human hands could never have imagined the ripple effects of that desperate decision. Her instinctive choice had not only saved her offspring's life, but had created a model for healing that would help thousands of traumatized veterans and countless endangered animals. In the vast ecosystem of human compassion, sometimes the smallest acts of trust generate the most profound transformations. Last month, Mitchell received a call that brought the story full circle in the most extraordinary way possible. Park rangers had discovered a female leopard with newborn cubs in distress near the exact location where Kesi's mother had made her desperate choice 5 years earlier. The mother was injured, likely from a territorial fight, and one of her cubs was showing signs of the same cardiac defect that had nearly claimed Kesi's life. When Mitchell arrived at the scene with his veteran team, something unprecedented happened. The injured mother leopard looked directly at him, then carefully picked up her weakest cub and placed it at his feet before retreating to a safe distance. It was as if the story of Kesi's rescue had somehow been passed down through leopard generations, creating an almost mythical understanding that this particular human could be trusted with their most precious and vulnerable offspring. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the former Navy corpsman whose letter had once moved Mitchell to tears, now stood beside him as the team's lead veterinary technician. Together they stabilized the tiny cub using the same techniques that had saved Kesi years before. The mother leopard watched the entire procedure from nearby rocks, her behavior calm and expectant, as if she knew exactly what was happening. As Mitchell held the small, warm body of the newest patient, he felt the weight of purpose that had defined his life since that first, desperate morning. The Kesi Foundation now represented hope not just for individual animals and veterans, but for the possibility that trauma could be transformed into healing, that broken creatures could save each other, and that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships create the most powerful change. If this story moved you, imagine the countless other veterans and animals still waiting for their chance at healing. Hit subscribe to follow more incredible stories of transformation and hope, and remember that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. The next chapter of healing might be just one act of compassion away.